good, isn't it? But it always has been a love story. I keep telling people, we met on a blind date. Judy was blind and I was the date. And for me it was love at first sight, and love continues. But the Bible is full of love stories. And I intended to put this phrase, we like the love stories that have the happily everlasting, ever after endings, don't we? Happily ever after. But those love stories, the problem with love stories is all of that time in the middle of the beginning and the end. Right? That's kind of what they talk about when you look on a tombstone and you see, here lies so-and-so born, so-and-so time, and died, so-and-so date. And the date of birth and the date of death is not what really matters. It's that dash that represents all of the living that they did between those two dates. So it's the beginning of a love story and the end of a love story. All that stuff in the middle is what sometimes we don't like. But sometimes it's very good. But the Bible gives us a Bible love story. I'm going to share a Bible love story with you this morning. And it's one of those stories that might not, we won't like the stuff in between the beginning and the end. It's the story of Hosea. The book of Hosea is a great book. And God authored that book to talk about his love for Israel, the northern tribes. I'll say a little bit about that history as we talk about the background of this book, because knowing the background of the book and then hearing what's said in the book is important for us to understand the book. So, Hosea chapter 1 verse 1 starts out by telling us the time of the history of Hosea's writing. The word of the Lord, which came to Hosea the son of Beeri during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, during the days of Jeroboam the son of Joash, the king of Israel. Now, Isaiah and Hosea are the same time. Amos and Isaiah and Hosea are talking about the same time period. Just read verse 1 of each book and you'll see they mention these kings. But Hosea deals with Israel, the northern tribes, after the division. Isaiah deals with Judah and the southern tribes. He tells you at the outset, he's writing about Judah and Jerusalem. So pay attention to the details. Hosea is written to talk about Israel, the northern tribes. And if you'll remember, when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam was going to show people how strong he was, and they rebelled, and the kingdom divided, and God gave 10 tribes to Jeroboam, and this Jeroboam in Hezekiah is Jeroboam's great-great-great-great-great-grandson. He was named after him. So all that time of idolatry, Jeroboam set up the idols and the worship, and of course Israel worshiped those gods. And during the time of Hosea, and this time, Assyria is going to come and take Israel away into captivity because of their unfaithfulness to God. They played the harlot with idols. The speaker, of course, is God. This is a message from God, folks, not just Hosea. God speaking through Hosea. The word of the Lord, which came to Hosea, is what we read in verse 1. And then in chapter 3, verse 1, he comes back to tell part of the story. Then the Lord said to me. So the Lord continues speaking to Hosea, and Hosea then speaking in the letter that he writes to the Jews. The recipients of the letters are Israel. Now remember this, folks. When the divided kingdom begins, Judah is separate from Israel. When he talks about Israel, he's talking about the northern tribes. And Israel, another name for Israel, in the book of Hosea, by the way, but in the Old Testament, is Ephraim, which comes after Joseph's son, Ephraim, which was a big tribe. And then another word for Israel is Samaria. We're talking about the 10 northern tribes. Israel was defeated and dispersed by Assyria in 721 BC. That's about the time of the writing of the book of Hosea. About 721, that area of time. Now, having said that, you get this big setting of the story. It's interesting. I'm teaching the book of Isaiah on Thursday afternoons as a Zoom class at 3 o'clock. Anybody interested in that, let me know. The details are in the bulletin that you could join that if you wanted to. But the importance of the background of the book and the time frame of it gives the lesson that Isaiah was speaking to Judah and Jerusalem. Hosea is speaking to Israel. So, the story. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry." What a way to start a love story. Go marry a whore who's going to give children of whoredom. What a relationship. God told Hosea, the man of God, go find you a wife that's going to become a whore. Because he's trying to paint a picture of God's relationship with Israel. That's what Israel had become. Now, I'll talk more about that. I want you to see that, but I want you to hear this story. I want you to see this. And when I get to the end of the story, I'm going to ask you a question. So just wait. Now, did Hosea go marry her and then she become a harlot? Or was he a harlot when she married her and and most scholars and authorities think she became one after he married her, because that's what Israel did. That aligned with Israel. So he married her thinking he was going to have a wife that was faithful and true, and she became a harlot. In verses 3 and 4 of chapter 1, so he went, and he took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, name him Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. So Jezreel is, historically, if you read it through the Bible, the place where God defeats his enemies. Now, I'm not sure how to think about this, because when you think about it, Hosea, the first child had, was a son. And every Jewish man wants to have a son to carry on his name. That was always true. Just look at the history. And yet, God uses that son to say, you name him the name of this valley where I defeat all my enemies, because I'm fixing to take care of Israel. That's the promise. So he had a son. Now, think about this. This son may have actually been Hosea's son. Maybe a little hope, a little help, but not in the name. The son Jezreel was a message of judgment. Then, in verses 6 and 7, she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to him, name her Lo-ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I would ever forgive them. Now, understand, the name of the child, daughter, no compassion, may be an implication that she's already started running around on him and conceived by another man. And this child named No Compassion. Maybe his heart's starting to break. But he says, I will have compassion on the house of Judah and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen. Now, just a picture of history. I got to tell you this just for my sake, so y'all just humor me and be patient with me, please. Assyria comes through and captures all Israel, all the cities around, and comes right up to the wall of Jerusalem and taunts the people in the city and says, your God ain't going to protect you. But Isaiah went and told Hezekiah, don't even worry, they won't even shoot an arrow. And they didn't. The Lord caused some kind of disease or something to go through the Assyrian army, and 185,000 of them died one night. And they went back home, didn't even fire an arrow at Judah and Jerusalem. And then the king of Assyria was assassinated by his sons when he went back home. God delivered Judah from the Assyrians because he's always faithful and true to keep his word. But since he's always true and faithful to keep his word, he is going to punish Israel, the northern tribes. They're going to captivity. And as far as we know, God never promised those northern tribes that they would ever come back to that land again. He did promise that he would redeem them in Messiah in the future, who we know as Jesus. And if you'll read Acts chapter 2 and see all those people who came from all the nations around were Jewish people who had come to Jerusalem to worship. They were part of those tribes that had been dispersed and scattered, who came back to God through Jesus. I'll say more about that. No compassion. Perhaps an indication she was not Hosea's daughter. And then he had a third child. She had a third child. When she was weaned, or when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son, and the Lord said, name him Lo-Ammi. What does Lo-Ammi mean? Not my people. What do you think that's an indication of? It wasn't his son. Wasn't from Hosea. She had already had a child with one of her customers. How sad. What a relationship. And God commanded that to happen because to paint the picture. Now let me ask you something. I'm going to ask you this question several times. What do you think of God now? Not my people, an indication that wasn't Hosea's son. She was what God said she would be, a harlot. Because God is painting a picture of Israel's harlotry with idols, with other gods. Their unfaithfulness. Well, that's not a love story, is it? You said you was going to tell us a love story, Gerald. Now we're going to get to it. The love story. And remember, I'm coming back to ask you again, what do you think about God now? Chapter 3, verse 1. Then the Lord said to me, go again and love a woman who is loved by her husband, yet an adulteress. Most scholars think, by the way, that Hosea is the man who loves the wife, and Gomer is the one he's going to love, going to get back. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but hang on. I just want to paint that picture for you as you read these verses. Loved by her husband, yet an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the sons of Israel. Though they turned to other gods, and they loved the raisin cakes, that is the food that they would feed for the idols. Remember, the worshiper got to eat part of the sacrifice that they offered to their God. Hosea loved Gomer. Think about that. She became a harlot. He still loved her. I had to put this here because I had to remind me of my story, y'all, so just humor me. When I graduated college, because I didn't have any money jingling in my pockets, I quit and went to work. And I went to work for a roofer just after Hurricane Carla had come through. And guess what? We had a lot of work. I didn't know nothing about roofing. I was a helper. I carried shingles. And I carried shingles up the ladder and down the ladder and all the things a helper does for 4 roofers. Busy. Boss said, well, Gerald, if you'll get ahead of them and get you a hatchet and learn how to nail shingles, then I'll let you be a roofer and I'll get another helper. So I'm going to tell you what, I worked hard. I run up them ladders with them shingles, and I learned how to nail them shingles, and I got to where I could nail them as faster than most of the roofers I was working with. And so I became a foreman on the crew because he had so much work. And one day it was raining. He said, Gerald, I want you to go with me. I got to hire some more roofers. And you know where we went to find roofers? All the bars. Went to all the bars. That's where roofers go when it's raining. Think about that. So we went to 2 or 3 places, and he finally come out of one, and he said, well, I hired a man in there, and he'll come to work tomorrow, and he's going to be in your crew. And that old boy showed up. And that was the meanest, ugliest, roughest looking man I've ever seen in my life. I'm telling you the truth when I tell you that. He was a rough looking man. And when he talked gruffly. When I told him what to do, I said, would you please go do that? But I got to know him. And having gotten to know him, found out he was not a gruff man inside. He was fairly easy to get along with after you get to know him. But he told me one day, he said, Gerald, you don't know how many times I've come home and found my wife in bed with another man. And of course, me being 19 and full of knowledge, full of experience, I told him, man, I'd kick her out. I'd throw her stuff on the yard and tell her never to come back. And he looked at me with the saddest eyes you've ever seen, with a rough face. And he said, but Gerald, I love her. I love her. I'm going to tell you something, folks. That's a sad story. That's a love story. That's a love story not unlike the one we're reading in the book of Hosea with God and Israel. Think about that. What do you think about God now? So Hosea says, I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and an omer of barley and an omer and a half of barley. She was being sold on the slave block. His wife, that wife that he had married and that had those kids, she was being sold as a slave. She had gotten so bad nobody wanted her anymore. And Hosea went and bought her back to himself. He bought her back as she was on the slave block. Do you hear that story? Do you hear God? Do you hear the message? A picture of God's redeeming love for Israel. Read the whole book. It'll do you good. Notice how often God talks about the rebelliousness of Israel. But God still loves the sinner, people. God still loves the rebel. The heart of God is the heart of love because God is love. Do you hear that? And the question comes back to you and me over and over again. What are we? What are we when we deal with people that don't like us, or people we don't like, or people who treat us badly? Now, don't misunderstand. God never condoned sin, and you know He punished it. You know He did. We can't condone sin. We can't condone immorality against us or anybody else. That can't be condoned. So at the end of chapter 1, going back there, when we talk about that the whammy, not my people, God says, in the place where it is said to them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are sons of the living God. Who? Not my people, but I'm going to take you back. I'm going to redeem you. And I'll call you my children, my sons, my daughters. Because God wants all people saved. Not all people will be saved. Know that. Not all people will come to God through Jesus Christ. Know that. But you know, God said through the prophet, I do not take any pleasure out of the death of sinners. I don't take pleasure in the death of rebels. I don't take pleasure in the death of those who are immoral or ungodly or unrighteous. God don't say, you're going to hell and I'm glad of it. Would we say something like that? Would we think something like that? And Peter picked up on that when he talked to the Jews who came to God through Jesus, who believed in Jesus as Messiah. He said, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness and into His marvelous light. Peter picks up on that, not my people, and says to them, you're my people. In Jesus, you're my people. You were once not a people, and now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So we come back to God's great love story, folks. You know, isn't it amazing how some verses just get hold on to us, you know? For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. There's a love story. There's a love story with a happy ending for those who will come to God through Jesus. So Paul says, hey y'all, this is the last verse. I'm just about through. Y'all are doing good. I haven't told y'all that yet this morning. Y'all are doing good. Did you see that story? Did you hear that story? What do you think of God now? Paul says, if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of His Son, much more. Some of the time when I use this verse, I kind of set people up, you know, I'll do the 6 through 8 verses. It talks about God's love, and I'll say, God can't do much more than that, can He? And people start shaking their head no, and then I'll go to this verse and say, much more having been reconciled, we shall be saved by His life. Now that we are His children, folks, what is it He won't do for us? I love that story because that's my story. I've been a rascal, a rebel, a sinner. But God loved me enough that somewhere along the line, I got the message. I got God's love story message, that he loved me and wanted me saved. Isn't that our story? Is that your story? If you've never come to God through Jesus Christ, it can be your story this morning. Repent of your sins, confess him as your Lord, be immersed with him in baptism, and raised to walk in newness of life. A son, a daughter of God. And then know that it will be for you truly a love story with a great ending. And if you need to come to God through Jesus this morning for any reason, we encourage you to do that as we stand to sing the invitation song. Would you come?
Would you live for Jesus and be always pure and good? Would you walk with him within the